to change. And this is something that I think is still going on. You can see some evidence of it in Austen's novel. Charlotte Lucas's own words there might indicate that for us. The argument goes something like this, and this is something that's still being debated, that marriage as a companionate relationship that involves exclusivity, fidelity, and love as a passionate feeling that's shared between two people, what we now think of as modern love and modern marriage, that's something that increasingly comes into being in the 18th century. It's not the way in which marriage was always thought about, but is in fact potentially a very modern way to think about two human beings relating to each other. And Austen, I think, takes up or questions this kind of system, this kind of change that's going on in her novels. You should be on the lookout for this in Persuasion, because I think it comes up a lot. And it's also because this whole system structures narratively a lot of her novels. We typically call this kind of plot the marriage plot. Now, we know this plot really well. It's been firmly entrenched in our culture. We know it from romantic comedies, perhaps most particularly, but also from dramas. Right? This is the narrative that guy and girl meet, guy and girl suffer some trouble or tribulation, guy and girl get married in the end. This also leads to the joke, right? What happens after marriage? Nothing. The marriage plot very much confirms that kind of thing, and Austen's novels often end with the marriage and their immediate aftermath. This was not always the case, and this was not always the case even for Austen's novelistic predecessors. And I'm just going to give you one example. 60 years before Austen started revising what would become Pride and Prejudice, a man named Samuel Richardson published a novel called Pamela. Pamela was an incredibly successful novel. It's also an incredibly difficult novel for modern readers to read. My poor students get subjected to it all the time. But another reason why is I'll give you some synopsis of the plot, and you'll probably be able to tell. The novel is about Pamela, a servant, and her upper-class master, Mr. B. Now, Mr. B takes an interest in Pamela, and in a series of increasingly violent episodes, which lead, in fact, to Pamela being kidnapped and nearly raped in one scene, Mr. B happens to fall in love with Pamela, and Pamela happens to fall in love with Mr. B. After constantly maintaining her virtue in the face of Mr. B's assaults, Mr. B and Pamela eventually get married. And you can even see just from the plot synopsis how anti-modern this kind of love story actually is for us, right? Now, Pamela, as I was saying, was an incredibly successful novel. It might have been the first media event in English history. This thing was read by everybody. It was turned into plays. It was satirized. It was pirated and sold all over the English continent, the European continent and the Americas. And what's so odd about it is that Mr. B and Pamela are very different kinds of characters, particularly when we think of their love, than we would think of now. What's even more interesting about the novel is that the marriage happens in the middle of the book. Half the novel deals with what happens after marriage. In fact, not too long into the book, you know that Mr. B and Pamela are going to get married. To us, this might seem incredibly strange. Well, what do you do after marriage? In fact, what this shows is 60 years before Austen's writing, a novelist like Richardson is really interested in a different set of questions. He's interested in what happens after marriage. For him, the questions are things like, well, what happens when a lower-class woman and an upper-class man get married? How do the families react? How does the wider society react? What happens when an employee marries an employer? What kinds of things go on, and what does it mean for English culture? These are kinds of questions that Austen and many other novelists of her period associate with the courtship. That's not something that happens after marriage. All of that has to get worked out ahead of time. That really leads to what we now think of as the marriage plot, where marriage is seemingly the ultimate conclusion of any life, of any human life. Your social life is wrapped up in when you get married, and after that, you're finished. You've achieved the thing, at least narrativistically, that we think of as, the ultimate destiny of most human beings. Austen Yeah.
Is it likely that Jane Austen read Pamela?
Is it likely that Jane Austen read Pamela? Oh, yes. Undoubtedly. The genealogy would be something like this. Richardson published Pamela in 1740. Incredibly successful novel. A real model for what eventually would become the female protagonist of authors like, in particular, Frances Burney, who was writing in the 1770s. Frances Burney, who was avidly read by Jane Austen. When she started writing her epistolary novels, she was really trying to write like Frances Burney. That's what she was trying to do. And she was not alone. Burney was a very successful female author, and a number of different women like Austen wrote like her.
Pamela was written by a man?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
Samuel Richardson. Samuel Richardson, who was a printer, actually, only decided to become a novelist, an author of any kind, because he was concerned about the representation of virtue in 18th century England and thought he'd write a kind of conduct book. And he started to write a series of letters, and the letters eventually turned into this novel. But even from my description, you can just see how much the representation of an institution like marriage, but also men and women, how they relate to each other, how far it's developed from a novel like Pamela to Jane Austen. Now, a lot of people suggest that Jane Austen is when the novel rises. This is the verb that's often used. And what that means is that Austen, in some ways, kind of perfected it. And if you ever want to put it upon yourself, read Pamela, and you'll see just how different it is. It's very difficult for us as modern readers to read Pamela. It just doesn't make any sense to us. Things don't happen the right way. Characters don't act the right way. The writing doesn't work the right way for us. They talk in ways that seem odd and different. That doesn't necessarily seem to be the case with Austen. In my experience, in those 60 years, something very significant happens to novelistic narration that becomes modern in the way that we think about it. And I can talk more about that if you like. Okay. I wanted to take some time now and just show some of these film clips because I think it's going to add a little bit more to what we think of as the adaptation in this question of marriage. And what I've done is I've put together a series of film clips that they're mostly from Pride and Prejudice. There's one at the end, but I'll save it as a surprise. That show significant scenes of romance, let's say. In two contemporary adaptations of Pride and Prejudice. The first, which you might be familiar with both of them. The first, the 1995 BBC version of Pride and Prejudice, the thing that made Colin Firth's career. And the other, the 2005 Focus Features, Pride and Prejudice, starring Keira Knightley. Very different films, actually, and very different adaptations in lots of ways. And what I'm going to do is actually show you corresponding scenes from each of the films. And talk a little bit, and you should feel free to talk a little bit too if you like, about these two scenes, because I think they'll show a lot about how we think about, Austen should think about marriage in the late 18th century.
I think this is the one. I think you're going to have to stand back here.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.